The European Union is making a huge push to streamline its rules with the goal of giving businesses a boost and cutting down on bureaucracy. But that might mean cutting corners on human rights and long-term economic welfare. Well, at least that's what a new study by trade union affiliated organization says. In this episode, we'll take a look at the official story behind the EU's Omnibus legislative packages, their focus on digitalization and support for businesses, especially small and mid-sized firms. Then we'll take a look at the controversy surrounding the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, which is designed to encourage responsible business conduct across global supply chains, and the risks that come with suggestions to weaken it. And with that, welcome to this episode of On Your Left, the news briefing that looks behind the headlines on economic developments, politics, and trade union issues in and around Europe. My name is Felix Sassmannshaus. So let's start with the official story. For the last few years, especially since 2024, the EU has been working hard to make itself more competitive. Geopolitical tensions and competition from countries like the United States of America and China have made this even more important. Back in September 2024, a big report by former European Central Bank President Mario Draghi had a big impact on this debate. The report said that the EU's sustainability reporting and due diligence frameworks are a major source of regulatory burden, but it also said that there should be strategic investments. Then the European Commission brought in the competitiveness compass and kicked off a simplification revolution, as it said. This movement is all about a bunch of legislative efforts called Omnibus packages, which were started between February and July 2025 under the new Commission. They're basically designed to make existing legislation simpler. The plan is clear. Get rid of unnecessary bureaucracy and make life easier for businesses, especially small and mid-sized companies. Denmark's Minister for Industry, Business and Financial Affairs, Morten Bødskov, recently said that this process is absolutely crucial for Europe's future when it comes to competing on the world market. One of the big things we're seeing in packages like Omnibus 4 is digitalization. The plan is to make digital formats the main priority, get rid of paper-based requirements in product legislation, and put the digital by default principle into action. In other words, get the European Union into the 21st century. This should offer more legal certainty and reduce costs, it is said. Another key focus is supporting growing firms, the so-called small mid-caps enterprises. In this regard, the Council this week agreed to raise the threshold for support measures to companies with fewer than 1,000 employees. The idea is to make things easier, clearer, and more efficient, and to cut red tape to the bare minimum to enable startups to grow faster. And that does make a lot of sense, but even though the ministers are all for it, there are still some worries. Some people are pretty critical of the plans, even saying that making things simpler actually means getting rid of important social and climate standards that have been fought hard for. This takes us straight to the heart of today's matter. What's going to happen to the EU Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive? This milestone of European legislation came into effect on the 25th of July 2024 after long debates and tough compromises were found. It was created to move on from voluntary standards that weren't really working. The directive says that companies have to spot, stop, reduce, and explain any negative human rights and environmental impacts that might happen when they're making their products. It wasn't long before companies started complaining about the extra red tape and costs for paperwork. The argument was, if the standards are too high, Europe's businesses might not be able to keep up with the competition. But is that really all there is to it? At the moment, there is a huge push to water down standards, with big companies like tobacco and oil multinationals using their influence to lobby for it. Maybe companies just want to keep making money from the competition for cheap labor and low environmental standards in the global south. But what are the real-world financial implications of the directive beyond the individual company's iffy business strategies. A recent study by economists working with the trade unions has given us a direct assessment of the expected economic effects of this directive versus the changes proposed in the Omnibus packages. The study says that weakening the directive, as suggested by the Commission and supported by the Council as well as parts of the European Parliament, is likely to have a big negative impact on the effects of the directive. So let's have a look at the concrete proposals that could end up undermining the directive's effectiveness. Firstly, the scope is reduced a lot. The Council's position, for example, suggests applying the directive only to companies with more than 5,000 employees and a turnover exceeding 1.5 billion euro. This would cut the number of affected companies by 70% from 3,363 to just 997 out of 10 million companies in the Eurozone in total that have supply chains outside the European Union. Secondly, the proposals mostly limit the due diligence obligations to Tier 1 suppliers. This is about the company's direct business partners in its value chain. The study says this will have a big impact on how well it works. Why? Well, supply chains are long and companies often use outsourcing and subcontracting. The Commission told me that companies wouldn't get around the regulation by outsourcing, but I really don't think that's very likely. The study, for example, shows that in cases like the 2013 Rana Plaza disaster, where a lot of workers died, most of the companies involved were already in or above Tier 1 in their European value chain. So just limiting it to Tier 1 wouldn't stop these human rights violations in the Global South. In addition, the proposals want to get rid of the EU-wide civil liability regime. This would make it really hard for people affected by human rights violations to claim compensation from European companies. Now, let's look at the important differences. What's the real economic impact of a strong due diligence directive according to the study? Economists say that sticking to the original directive is set to have a really positive effect on the Global South's economy and be a net benefit to the European economy as well. Contrasting other assessments, this way of thinking sees human rights violations and environmental impacts as a market failure, which is basically a negative externality. By making sure everyone plays by the rules, the directive fixes these market problems and boosts economic well-being, the economists state. The costs of due diligence, on the other hand, are minimal. The economists calculated that the cost of due diligence is less than 0.01% of the turnover of big companies. On the other hand, it's thought that the current directive will actually have a pretty positive effect on the EU economy, possibly adding between 0.01% and 0.02% to European gross domestic product in total. For the Global South, the benefits are huge, cutting out all the negative stuff like work-related deaths, injuries, and diseases. For example, the study estimates that the current directive could reduce work-related external costs linked to EU imports by 15 to 30%, amounting to 3 to 6 billion euro annually. So, what the study is saying is that the Commission's Omnibus approach, by focusing on short-term cost reduction, misses a strategic opportunity. If we weaken the directive, they say, we'll lose the chance to create a level playing field, and European companies will be at a disadvantage against non-European rivals who use human rights abuses to undercut their prices. The directive would give EU companies some protection from this downward pressure. If Europe doesn't start thinking about its long-term strategy regarding human rights abuses and climate standards, it'll end up losing its competitive edge on the global stage, it is claimed. And that's also why in Germany alone, more than 100 mid-sized and large companies are in favor of the regulation. So, the EU's Omnibus process is supposed to cut red tape and help businesses compete in the short term by using digital tools and supporting mid-caps. But it's getting a lot of flack for how it handles sustainability laws. Experts see the strong due diligence and sustainability directive as a benefit to the economy, fixing problems in the market and setting the global standards we need. The proposed Omnibus amendments, on the other hand, could lead to ineffective token legislation that keeps some costs but misses out on the huge positive welfare gains that strong human rights and environmental protection can deliver. So the question is, will trying to make things simpler now end up damaging the things that could help workers in the global south and even companies to compete successfully in the long term? That's all for today. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you have any comments on the episode, please feel free to share your thoughts either in the comments or send me a direct message. To stay up to date, subscribe to my newsletter, which is published every Tuesday. My name is Felix Sassmannshausen. Have a great week.